I'm Calvin Samuel, Methodist minister for the Essex towns of Hockley, Rochford and Rayleigh on the edge of Southend. Welcome to Worship Academy, the initiative of the Southend Leigh Methodist circuit to resource local preachers and worship leaders. Tonight we'll be exploring the question, how to be anti-racist. The police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in the United States earlier this year received worldwide attention. Alongside such obvious abuses of power have come the revelation that in the US and UK at least, COVID-19 infection and death rates among Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities has been disproportionately higher than in white communities. However, the story that affected me most was learning that Metropolitan Police officers here in the UK took selfies with the bodies of murdered black women, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, daughters of the former Archdeacon of Southend, Mina Smallman, and shared those images. This was now not a story of people far away in the US. This was here and now in the UK, and it happened to a clergy family like mine connected to Southend. This constellation of events this year alone has resulted in systemic racism being laid bare. What might long have been suspected, concealed and whispered had now become far more visible and transparent and undeniable. We live in a racist society, one in which structures and policies result in inequalities between racial groups, and where the state is an active participant in perpetuating such inequalities and injustice. It is that stark revelation of the reality of ongoing racism in the very systems of our society, despite anti-discrimination legislation and the gains of civil rights movements, that has sparked Black Lives Matter protests around the globe. And those protests, I think, have stirred something in many of us. For some, it was the recognition that it's not enough to be non-racist. We all need to be anti-racist if we're going to see the changes that we so desperately need. For others, it was a recognition of white privilege and unconscious bias. Sadly, for some, it has provoked or perhaps unmasked hidden inclinations to white supremacy or fragility. Some of the things that I have seen posted on social media by colleagues and members of our churches, people I've thought of as friends, just beggars belief. The regrettable truth is that despite recent hopes of creating a post-racial society, we nonetheless still live in a racist society. And Martin Luther King's dream that one day children could be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character is as yet not fully realised. The longer we take to acknowledge this, the longer we allow injustice to prevail unchecked and unchallenged, and the longer we allow lives to be blighted and destroyed by racism. Racism comes in all sorts of forms and nuances and is rooted in a toxic combination of ignorance, fear and prejudice. Not all racisms are equal. The racism that concerns me most is not that of the far right, whose doctrine of white supremacy is at least evident and undisguised. The racism that concerns me most is not what's posted on the social media pages of those who should know better and whose Christian faith should have pointed them in an entirely different and far more compassionate direction. No, what concerns me most is the racism so deeply embedded in the system that it creates outcomes that are deeply injurious to people of colour. Here are some statistics that should concern us in the UK. The Black, Asian and minority ethnic population of our youth offenders institutions runs at around 51%, despite making up only 18% of the 10 to 17-year-old population. So unless you believe that young people of colour are 3 times more criminal than white young people, then the system is producing a wildly unfair result. Young people of colour make up just under 50% of those not in education, employment or training. That's nearly the same percentage of those imprisoned. that's not entirely unrelated. Young people excluded from education can be up to 4 times as likely to end up in prison. Edinburgh University has been researching this issue in a project that's been running for 21 years, tracking over 4,000 young people who started secondary school in 1998. And here's one of the things that they concluded. In practice, the criminal justice system serves to punish poverty, the socially marginalized and vulnerable individuals, as much as those who steal, assault, or murder. And speaking of poverty, according to the UK government's own race disparity audit published in 2017, 1 in 4 children from Asian households and 1 in 5 from black households live in poverty, compared to 1 in 10 from white households. So children are more than twice as likely to live in poverty in this country today if they are people of colour. This is tied to unemployment. 1 in 25 white British adults are unemployed, compared to 1 in 10 black and Asian adults. That's to say, black and Asian people are 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed in Britain today. So let's just summarise. A child is twice as likely as her peers to live in poverty, 3 times as likely not to be in education, employment or training, 3 times as likely to be in a young offenders institution, and 2.5 times as likely to be unemployed when they become an adult. And they're 6 times as likely to be stopped and searched by the police. Those are the government's own figures. Those are the odds stacked against children of colour in the UK today. And that, my friends, is what systemic racism looks like. That's the racism I care about most. For here is a racism in which the state is an active participant, perpetuating inequalities and injustice. The cost in human lives, in unfulfilled potential, as well as the financial burden to the state and ultimately to taxpayers of systemic racism, is enormous. Moreover, the system is robust. It's functioning as designed to prop up false and discredited notions of Eurocentricity and white supremacy. It has already proved to be incredibly resistant to change or challenge. Despite the gains of civil rights movements over the past 2 generations, despite the fall of apartheid regimes, despite the leadership of iconic statesmen and presidents of colour like Nelson Mandela in South Africa and Barack Obama in the United States, systemic racism still persists. Racism persists in all sorts of places, among all sorts of people. And we in the church are hardly immune from racism or unconscious bias. In some areas, churches are making great strides. In others, less so. By way of example, our President-designate of Methodist Conference for 2021, the highest office in British Methodism, is for the first time in our history a black woman. Nonetheless, if we look further afield at our senior leaders over the years, whether that's presidents and vice presidents of conference, chairs of district, superintendents of circuits, college principals, stewards, treasurers, circuit reps, the synod, that picture becomes far, far less diverse. Racism persists because it's not primarily a skin problem. It's ultimately a sin problem. It's not our skin colour that causes racism, nor is it cultural differences. It's actually a much more deeply rooted and sinister problem, rooted in white supremacist or Eurocentric ideals, which have shaped philosophical, political, and economic discourse and decisions for centuries. That Eurocentric or white supremacist ideology found its worst historic expression in slavery and in the colonial dominations of other peoples. It's an ideology that created the idea of whiteness and its innate superiority, but at the same time created the idea of the inferiority of other races and of dark-skinned people of African descent in particular. And it's not just racist white people who think this about black people. All too often, black people also believe similar ideas about other black people. The myth of white superiority is deeply ingrained in all our psyches, not just that of racists. Racism is learned behavior inculcated over centuries, and it is a struggle for us to unlearn and to deconstruct it. So this is what we're dealing with. And when I say we, I don't only mean people of colour. I mean we, civilized society, we, the people of God of every tribe and language, we, people of goodwill who believe deeply and profoundly that there is only one race, the human race. Veteran civil rights campaigner Angela Davis famously declared, "In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." So how can we be anti-racist, especially with a Christian perspective? So how can we be anti-racist, especially with a Christian perspective? Well, what we're doing now is an important first step. We need to talk about it. Talking about race is deeply uncomfortable for most people in Britain. It's deeply personal. It dredges up parts of our history we'd rather not confront. We'd prefer to live in a post-racial society. After the election of Barack Obama in 2008, I dared to dream that we might just be edging towards a post-racial society where our racial identity no longer really mattered. After all, the idea of race is, in the history of human ideas, a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, one's race was not one's defining characteristic. The Roman Empire, for example, was not racially defined. Romans were African, European, Asian. But I was wrong. We were not edging towards a post-racial society as history has demonstrated. And on reflection, we could never have got there because we have never acknowledged, repented, or made reparation for our racist past as a nation. We've never looked at ourselves and owned the fact that a large part of what made Britain Great Britain was the wealth, resources and raw materials and human chattel taken from other peoples by force. How can we as a country get past racism when we've never acknowledged our racist past? Talking about it is unpleasant and uncomfortable. But unless we have those long overdue conversations, we'll never be able to move past it. Repressed memories of abuse and trauma will continue to bubble up in unexpected places in our communities and indeed in our churches. Do you know that the first difficult conversation that the church had way back in the book of Acts were to do with race? In Acts chapter 6, as the church was newly formed, Hebrew and Greek believers fell out over the neglect of Greek widows. In Acts 10 and 11, there was further conflict as Gentiles became Christians. And they had difficult conversations which enabled them by Acts 15 to develop an understanding of how Jewish and Gentile Christians, Greeks and Hebrews, could live together as sisters and brothers in Christ. It wasn't a perfect solution. It didn't simply resolve all the issues, but it did set the course for who they wanted to become. And that vision has been expressed beautifully in Galatians 3:28 and 29. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There's no longer male and female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs, according to the promise. So how to be anti-racist? Step 1. Have the difficult conversations. Organize conversations through your local churches and community centres. Write to your MPs. Ensure that praying for the end of systemic racism becomes an ongoing part of your prayer lives. Set up anti-racism reading groups to begin to educate yourselves and your communities. And this brings me to the second step, education. The river of racism has 3 primary tributaries: ignorance, fear, and prejudice. Ignorance allows us to hold views about others which are simply wrong. And those wrong ideas often feed our fears. And with ignorance and fear in the system, it's only a small hop to prejudice, which leads to inequality, oppression, and injustice. We can best react to systemic racism and to our own internal prejudice by educating ourselves and others. For racism is ultimately based on disinformation. Some of it is intentional and malevolent, much of it is unconscious and ignorant, and all of it is unable to stand under the scrutiny of knowledge and common sense. So step 2 of being anti-racist is to educate ourselves and others. And this is not just for people who are white. People of colour also need to be educated themselves. This year I've been doing a lot of reading by black authors as I attempt to educate myself towards becoming anti-racist. I started with Rayleigh Edolodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I moved on to Afua Hirsch, British, Akalas, Natives, Ibram Zendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, which of course influenced the title of this talk, David Olusoga's Black British History, and the list goes on. And I have more books on my reading list that I've not yet got to. History has shown that people with power rarely give it away or share it with others voluntarily. It has to be demanded. And this is what the Black Lives Matter protests are ultimately about. But protests do not really change things. Protest draws attention to issues. It creates a sense of urgency around those issues, but for things to change requires far more than protests. It often requires some kind of political and practical solution. And this brings me to the third step of being anti-racist. We need to get political, to engage with our MPs and local authorities on issues to do with anti-racism, to write to our local schools, to find out whether people of colour are represented on the governing bodies and in the classrooms. And if there aren't, perhaps we should seek out appropriately qualified people and encourage them to volunteer to support our local schools. Questions need to be asked about how Black history is taught in the curriculum and whether the school is actively seeking to be anti-racist. How far are they aware that young people of colour are disproportionately represented among those excluded or known to social services? And how is the school seeking to respond to this? Racism is not a black problem. And black people aren't going to be the ones to fix it, to be the magic bullet. Nor should we be expected to come up with solutions to the problem. Humanity managed to put a man on the moon. We're currently working to find a vaccine for COVID-19, and few seriously doubt that we will one day achieve that. So how is it that we can't collectively find a solution to racism? I think we can. Within the church, we certainly all need to be working together on this, white and black and brown. So, step 3 of being anti-racist, get political. And step 4, I suggest, is to engage with our young people, especially those most at risk of racism. It's an African proverb that reminds us that it takes a village to raise a child. In a country such as this one, where the statistics are so dangerous for children of colour, we need to look out for those children and provide them with a different narrative for their lives. And we need to fight for them, to resist systemic racism for them. And those at risk of racism include not only young people of colour. It also includes those likely to be shaped by racist ideologies of a whole range of races. We also need to fight for them and to ensure that all young people can see positive role models. Step 4 of being anti-racist is to engage with our young people. And this might involve supporting charities and other organisations already doing great work among young people. Not all of us are cut out for working with young people, and frankly, few of us have the energy. But we can support those who are already there, financially, by volunteering on their governing bodies, by publicising their work, by praying for them, all whilst seeking to be encouraging and supportive of the young people we do know in our communities, in our churches. And the focus on young people is important, because we've already got it wrong for our generation. If we can support them to get it right for theirs, the world can be a different place. The 5th and most important step in being anti-racist, I suggest, is to pray. When it's all said and done, we can change laws, as we have done. We can protect rights, as we have done. We can elect brown places to high places, as we have done, all without changing the situation. A change of heart is ultimately what's needed, and that change of heart is beyond our capacity to effect. So we need to get praying, and keep praying, while we put into practice all the things that we already know and will learn in the future how to do. Let's take a moment now to reflect.